This is Guitar Business Radio, the podcast for the business of guitar. No reviews, no demos, no idle chatter, just useful dialogue and information to help you get the most out of your guitar-related business. Whether you're a guitar builder or a guitar player or just something in between, this is for you. Now, here's your host. Oh, wait, it's me, Jeffrey D. Brown. So let's get to it. Well, here we are at episode 6. You know, I've heard it said in some circles that if you make it to 6 episodes, your odds of making it to 7 and beyond are greatly enhanced. Really a brilliant observation. And with that, I have good news. Episode 7 of GBR is already in production, including an interview with Bill Conklin of Conklin Guitars and Basses, who, in my view, is truly a pioneer and innovator in the extended range instrument market. You know, we're typically working on at least 3 episodes ahead, and I can tell you that Mondays come around pretty quickly these days, and when you're cranking out a weekly show that is more heavily produced like this one, you've got to stay on top of it. And that's one of the many things that differentiates this podcast from so many others, which in my opinion is aptly described by one of our common slogans. You've heard it. No reviews, no demos, no idle chatter, all business. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that any of those first 3 items are necessarily bad. Lots of podcasts in both video and audio do just that. In fact, it's more than lots, it's most. And I'm not judging, but that's what it is, and that's fine. But what truly differentiates GBR from others is less of what we're not and more about what we are. And that's how we should operate in business and in our personal lives, in my opinion. And you can hear more about that in the value shot at the end of the show. Look, Guitar Business Radio is and will continue to be unique. We take the business side of things seriously, but not so seriously that we don't want to have fun with it. After all, we want you to get value from listening to the show, but we also want you to enjoy it. So we won't be afraid to lighten it up at times, poke fun at the business as warranted, or just take an off-center look at things that you won't get anywhere else. One of our objectives at GBR is to give you genuine insights into the business of guitar from our own view at times, but especially from key people in the industry, which includes, as we often say, guitar builders to guitar players and anything in between. That covers it all. And by the way, when I say players, I'm talking about professionals in the business and those who are looking to play professionally. They're all connected to the business side, or will be. So we'll be going in that direction as well. All in all, our goal is to give you something that you won't get anywhere else. And I'm happy to say that many of the positive comments we've received about the show touch on just that, like this is something we've really needed, or there isn't anything quite like it. You know, you get the idea. But you'll often hear me disclaim certain things that I say and question the originality, finality, or absoluteness of something. And I could do that here. But one thing I can say with absolute confidence is that what we're doing on GBR, you will not get anywhere else. Even if 100 people decided to copy us, we would still be unique and original. And that's the way it's going to be. You know, I've told many people privately that I have an internal criteria for everything we produce on this show. It's similar in method to the things like the 3 C's and other stuff I've talked about in the value shot. The 3 checkoffs that are required here are simply win, win, and win. And that's not about winning in the political sense. In fact, this is basically a politics-free zone, if you don't mind. I'll explain a bit more about that in another episode. But here it is. We have essentially 3 sets of stakeholders with this show. They are listeners, that's most of you. Participants, that's a few of you, and more would be better. And producers, that's us. So it's a 3-way win, a trifecta of sorts. And that's also the order of importance in terms of how we have to see it. It has to be a win for our listeners. Without them, we just have a vanity-like show that allows us to say, hey, you know, we're doing a show. Cool, huh? But to build the kind of value and engagement and longevity that we're looking for, the listener has to come first. As for our participants, we want them to get something out of it as well. This is not gotcha reporting or anything like that. We're not out to get anybody. That does not mean we're not going to cover sensitive or even controversial issues. We will, but we'll do it honestly and fairly and in the context of our overall mission. Finally, it has to be a win for us. Otherwise, really, why do it? So the win for us, and for me personally, is it's got to be fun. It's got to be enjoyable, satisfying, and worthwhile. And I can tell you from my perspective, it's all of those things. And I think, as most of you will agree, when you love what you do and you do it well, it never feels like work. And this never does. And hopefully, it'll stay that way. That all being said, if you like what we're doing and the direction that we're going, we hope you'll support the show and help us make it the best that it can possibly be. I mentioned briefly in last week's episode that we've created our own hybrid crowdfunding program called Supporting Roles. And I'm happy to report we've already gotten our first show supporters. And starting soon, we'll be adding our brief but important segment to the show called, appropriately, Supporting Roles. And again, that is a part of the win-win-win formula, as you'll see. So for more information on any of that, just visit the Supporting Roles section on our website at guitarbusinessradio.com, or just contact us and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Now, something else I want to bring to your attention that you may not be aware of is our GBR hotline. You've heard me say many times we want to add your voice to the mix, and this is a really easy way to do that. You can record a shout out, a testimonial, an opinion, something newsworthy, or just about anything that is relevant. That's the key, relevant. Just call our hotline at 877-228-4703 and press 2. That's 877-228-4703 and press 2. That's all there is to it. We'll pick the best and most appropriate messages in any category, and we'll play them on the show for the benefit of our listeners. So if you have something to say, let's hear it. Be sure to mention your name and company if you like. Go ahead and give it a shot. And of course, there's more info on this in the Participate section of our website. Now, I'm afraid it's time for this. Now it's time for Questionable Moments, the segment where we bring up relevant questions of interest to our listeners, bat them around a bit, and see just what kind of answers we can come up with. So in episode 5, we brought up the following question: what's in the pipeline for guitar accessories? And as usual, there was a predictable variety of responses. These came from our website. Tom chimed in with, I wouldn't know where to start, but I think a good place is with those phone apps. This has to be one of the biggest things in guitar accessories since they've become, in so many ways, like a virtual Swiss Army knife. So I guess that's where much of the pipeline is being filled from. Well, I think that's a relevant factor, Tom. Certainly there's a lot of development going on there, including where I've seen in some cases actually embedding the phone directly into a guitar to add some kind of specific functionality. Here's a different point of view from Alex. As an inventor of guitar accessories, I saw many cool innovations in our booth section at Winter NAMM. Major advances will not likely come from big names, but rather it looks like they are emerging from smaller, independent entrepreneurs thinking beyond conventional mindsets, especially in the area of hardware innovation, which I saw many cool examples of. People tend to overlook hardware, but that segment is showing surprising advances, for guitarists especially. Well, I think you're right, Alex. We're often attracted to the glitzy, high-tech gadgetry out there. But if a product can clearly demonstrate a useful benefit, that's generally value that will convert to sales more easily. But then there was Carmine, who added this. Think basics, picks, straps, strings, cables, that sort of thing. You know, the stuff you actually need to play. Everything else is peripheral and superfluous. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with basics, Carmine, especially when you add a few big words to top it off. And you mentioned strings, which I think would have to kind of top the list of most necessary guitar accessories. And it turns out that on that topic, we'll be talking in just a few moments with Jon Moody of GHS Strings, who shares some very interesting insights about the company that's been an icon in the string business for a very long time. So stick around for that. Now, on to this week's new questionable moment. We're going to be asking, What is the state of the extended range guitar and bass market? Now, admittedly, this is a bit more narrow than some of the questions we've asked, but we'd like to hear your thoughts on the subject. And as always, you can share them on our website at guitarbusinessradio.com and click on questions. We'll also post them on our Facebook or Twitter page at Guitar Business. Now, for something completely different. Well, Jon Moody holds several titles at GHS Strings, among them Director of Digital Brand Development and Product Development. For those of us who've been around a long time, GHS has pretty much been synonymous with guitar and bass strings. But there's a rich and interesting history to the company that's been a fixture in the business for over 50 years. And to give us a unique behind-the-scenes view of GHS, the company, Jon Moody joins us today. So, Jon, thanks for coming on the show with us today. Glad to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jeff. This is going to be fun.
Awesome. Well, let's first talk about, as I like to say over and over again, a few foundational things to get started. I mean, GHS Strings really is a household name in the guitar world, for sure. I mean, we're talking 50 some odd years. But I thought maybe first we could talk a little bit about the history of GHS and touch on some of the, milestones along the way. Look, this all started back in the 60s. I was growing up at that time, and I know you were not at GHS at that time, but you're a knowledgeable guy. I know that, and you know some things. So I was kind of hoping that maybe you could give us some of the backstory and some of the early highlights to get us started.
Yeah, the story of GHS actually starts with the VC Squire Company, which was a string winding company in the area doing violin and mandolin strings and others in Battle Creek, which, as many will know, is about 15-20 miles down the road from Kalamazoo, Michigan, which at that point was just cranking out Gibson mandolins left and right. And then as they moved to guitar, the VC Squire Company did strings for that as well.
Got it.
In August 1st, 1964, three families with the last name of Gould, Holcomb, and Solco.
That's the GHS, right?
That is the GHS. That is the first question we usually get. Who are three string winders from the VC Squire Company, left and decided to do their own. And they were incorporated by a lawyer in the area named Robert McPhee. They started strictly as OEM, making strings just for companies, and then started, as they saw the need, labeling their own strings. The first big label was called the Gus brand strings, which had kind of a character that looked like Cousin It playing a guitar on it. People still ask about those, and those are now our nickel rockers. But as the company grew, the Goulds and the Solcos left. So the Holcombs, after probably about the first or second year, were the only original people left. Nice. Realizing they were better workers than business people, they talked to Mr. McPhee, who offered to take over and buy the company.
Wow, that's a big deal.
And and as the company grew through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the McPhees still stayed on board. In fact, second generation Holcombs were here as well. Dave Holcomb is very famous in the music industry as our artist rep, and also one heck of a banjo player. And he's still around. He's retired, but he's still playing banjo and everything. Mr. McPhee himself still comes into the office when he is not doing the snowbird thing down south. His son, Russ McPhee, is the current president. So it's still a family-owned and operated company. And as you said, we celebrated 50 years back in 2014, and
that was
a
big
going.
deal. That was there was a lot of hype about that, was there not?
Yeah, and that was actually right as soon as I came on board. Was kind of as social media, it was the first thing of, okay, glad to have you here. How are you going to roll this out?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and having something like that, there's a lot of value in having that kind of longevity and stability. But that's a pretty interesting background to get started with. But I think maybe before we go too much further, let's fill in the gap of how Jon Moody came to GHS. And by the way, I want to know something about those bow ties.
All right. Well, I'm a freelance musician in the Southwest Michigan area. My usual gigs are musical theater and studio work, so I'm usually paid to be under a pit. instead of actually being on top of a stage. But because of that, I approached them as an endorsing artist. So I started out working with an artist rep here around 2011, and I would do product demos for them back in the beginning because I was trying to be a little more objective in terms of doing a video that will actually showcase what the strings can do instead of, hey, this is me playing slap bass really, really fast. It's more of, okay, here's me playing this one groove. Here's me doing something else. Things that I guess more the average guy would say, oh, that's exactly how I would play these. Mm-hmm. Okay, I get a good idea.
So you're doing you were doing some demos and that sort of thing? Doing some video demos with GHS, doing some other ones for other effect pedal companies, just because at that point I thought it was fun and I saw there was a small market that was being missed here of just actual usable bass videos. Mm-hmm. So roughly about 2013, I met the artist rep for Tacos in March, asked him about how the NAMM show was, and he kind of lamented that they had a social media guy that shortly after the NAMM show he had left the company, so he was kind of taking care of a lot of this stuff and doing double duty. And as I just kind of, without skipping a beat, said, so that means you guys are hiring? And he stopped, looked at me and said, you'd be really good for this. So a couple months later, I walked into GHS as an employee. Yeah.
So that's
how it got started.
Yeah, the rest of that is history. And in terms of the bow ties, it started out as a joke. I would dress up in the office every now and again just because I think of that whole thing of work clothes and play clothes is kind of there's a big psychological shift. When you come back from the office, you take off that shirt and you put on like a T-shirt. It's kind of like you're taking off the day's cares.
Right.
So I would dress up at work, and I would wear a bow tie sometimes, and the boss would ridicule me a lot, which he enjoyed, and I didn't think of it too much. So I thought to really be a sticking point, one day at NAMM, I wore a bow tie, and the response was overwhelming because in a show like that, the artists that would come up to me and said, "Do you know how easy it was to find you?" I just
you may be the only one.
The bow tie.
That's right.
Well, I believe it's Harvey Levy from Levy's Guitar Straps also wears a bow tie, but we are there's a slight age difference there.
Probably.
So, but so I did that. Everybody liked it. I looked at the boss. We both kind of shrugged, and every video or interview that I'm on video for, I've worn a bow tie just because that's my thing now. People expect it.
It's sort of a branding kind of thing, and
right.
Nothing wrong with that. Let me just ask you a little bit before we go into some of this other weedy stuff.
Yeah.
About the facility. Now, I understand that's grown over the years. Can you tell us a little bit about what the GHS facility looks like today and how it grew?
Yeah, it's the funny thing is everyone, when they come here, I make the joke that you can tell when we bought that part of the building because of the wallpaper.
Got it.
So it started out as a very small building, which actually isn't here anymore. The building that it started out in is actually our current parking lot, but then they bought the next building over because it's in a little industrial park area of Battle Creek right by the airport. Mm-hmm. So they bought the next building over, and then they moved everything in there. And then as it started growing too, they kind of bought the building behind it and then built a entryway into that. And then they bought the building next door. And at some point, those two buildings were connected, which is always an interesting story because some of the people that were here when I first started that had been around for like 30 years here would tell me stories of like in the winter times in Michigan, when it's snowing really poorly, they would take the wound strings, that they had just finished. They would put them on a little dolly, and they would take them across the parking lot in the snow to go and put them in the packaging area, which is mind-boggling to me considering how many steps we take now to make sure everything is, humidity controlled.
Sure.
Everything's in an oxygen-free environment. And then back in the 70s and early 80s, they're just pushing these things in dollies across an open-air parking lot.
Wow. A challenge.
Yeah. At this point, it's a fairly sizable fairly sizable factory that also has the office area where we're at, and then it's got the shipping and receiving in the back. And we also have 2 other big warehouses that are separate but still on the same campus, I would say, that we store a lot of our labels in, and some of the older stuff that's more or less part of the GHS history, like a lot of the old marketing graphics and some of the old NAMM booths when they used to ship them back and forth.
That's the archives, huh?
That's the archives, yeah. One of them is called the birdhouse because that's where we find a lot of nests. So that's usually, it's a very old building with a flat roof. So,
and the thing that always stands out in the imagery that we see is that brick wall with the GHS name on it, which is, to me, says, well, this place has been around a long time.
Yeah, and you can see that right from Dickman Road on in Battle Creek if you're driving by.
Along the same lines, I've seen some video, promotional video from GHS that shows kind of what's going on inside the facility and the manufacturing and that sort of thing. And they talk a little bit about some of the unique way that they do this process, and some of these are ways that they've been doing for some time, and there's a lot of handwork that's involved, and it's not entirely and completely automated with robots and mechanized and things like that, right?
Right, absolutely. A lot of people the first time they come in here, they know a string winding factory from when How It's Made did a segment on Didario's factory, which is awesome. It's super cool, and it shows how highly technical they are. We are not that. We have our own machine shop in-house, so we make our own machines. But because of that, too, they are very more hands-on. So they have a person running 2 machines at a time, whereas I think some of the more automated ones you can do up to 8. And then we still use the original hand winders that were done in the 60s when they first started the company. Yeah.
Really?
And a lot of people ask for that. And also, it allows us to, in terms of some of these more specialty strings like you're talking about that have, especially for bass players, like an exposed core or a taper core for the bigger strings, it's much easier to do those on a hand winding machine because it's easier to stop the string or wind it backwards instead of just putting them on an automated machine and going forward.
One would think that that's a little bit slower process, is it?
It is, but the people that work on it are very good, and especially when you're doing that machine for 8 hours a day, I like to think too that much like playing an instrument, they really get a hands-on idea of how that machine's going to function, how everything really reacts, so they can make some changes in how they do things on the fly.
That's fascinating. Let's move to a slightly different area here. There's obviously, talking 5 decades, there's a pretty long history here. But from what you know, John, I'm kind of curious to know about how GHS's marketing may have evolved over the years. And can you shed any light on that at all?
Yeah, because we actually do have a room in the back that still has all the old ad slicks.
That's cool. Oh,
it's sweet. My former life before GHS was in graphic design, doing corporate identity and wide format printing. So to see old ad slicks, I think is super awesome, just to remember how they had to set those up.
Well, I don't know if you were back in the 80s. I ran an agency. We did a lot of production work and a lot of design work, and that's the other half of on my right side of the brain. But I always remember those days of wax and galleys and paste ups and things like that. So I came from really old traditional media. And, it's hard to imagine, of course, doing that now. It seems like dinosaur age. I don't know if you were around at that point, but I suspect not.
Not then, but I still, my first job was in a small town newspaper. So I still did wax layouts and paste ups.
Sure. Well, that's it. And you did it. Of course. So, yeah. Of course. Fascinating. But so in terms of you've seen some of that, I mean, could you portray what you think has kind of been the evolution at all since that time? Or is it just kind of been the same thing? Well,
a lot of it, I think, it followed the trends of the times, because in the 70s, a lot of them back there were very simple, focusing strictly on the product, especially when Guitar Boomers came out, which is a nickel-plated steel string. Everybody was pushing that out because that was the new innovation at the time. In the 80s, especially with the hair metal scene, the ads really took on a more flamboyant nature, featuring artists. And the products kind of took a much smaller part to the wayside. And the past couple of years, we've seen us trying to go back to more of the product focus, but also strike a balance to have key artists in these ads, but then also tout ourselves as the string experts, which has been our slogan for quite some time. So it's been trying to go now more on a not so much using catchphrases like we're the best or the most innovative, the latest string design that pushes the envelope, that kind of thing. We've tried to really just say, look, these are what our strings do. This is what they're going to do for you. And if you've got questions about that, we're right here.
So it's a little more focus on the implied benefit of the product and kind of trying to establish that part of it as opposed to the imagery that says, I can identify with this or...
Yeah, it's been a little bit more of that. And I think some of that comes by with what we've talked about we've been around for over 50 years. So we know a thing or two about strings. And when you pick up some of our stuff, you will know you've got that knowledge base behind you.
Yeah. I know you wear multiple hats there.
Yes.
I know you have a sort of a two-pronged title, but my understanding is you do some other things along with that too, and have some connection to some of the artist relations things.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm kind of curious to know a little bit about the endorsement side of things and how much of a significant factor that is strategically for GHS. I mean, I know it's commonplace, but I'm interested to know what you think the impact of that is in your business. Yeah,
it's very interesting because unlike a guitar company or an amp company or something like that, where if you see them on stage or on TV playing, there's immediate recognition. You can look and say, oh, he's playing a Fender because it is there, or he's playing an Ampeg amp. These are your brands right there. You can't really see a brand of strings from a stage or things like that. So having key artists, it's kind of, there's two sides to it. I mean, you obviously want names. You want big names that people can immediately identify with, that people just go to you because that's huge cred, that somebody will say, I just used, all of these landmark albums were recorded using these strings or this equipment. People are going to look out for that because there's so many forums where people say, how do I sound like so-and-so? And strings are always on that list as well as everything else. But on the other side, especially in this day and age of social media, we need those people to be brand ambassadors,
right,
as well, right. That will speak out about the strings. This is why I like them. This is why you should try them. Or something as simple as an Instagram picture of getting new strings that we just sent you, whether you got them as a discount or a freebie or things like that, or even taking a picture of you doing casual things, but you've got a GHS branded shirt on. It's more now that it's important to get those brand ambassadors that will speak about the strings.
That's kind of almost,
as much as just the names themselves.
That's kind of almost a variation on product placement in certain way. I mean, it's a different thing,
very much so.
But but there's a similarity. And so with the endorsers, do you find that they're able to, on social media, for instance, have a proactive activity that helps you, or do you have to stay on that, or what?
We politely request it, and especially with all the newer artists, it's now all in their contract.
Got it. Okay, that's interesting.
But most of the younger generation, they're on top of it anyway. They kind of already know how it goes, and we don't have to do a thing. It's usually I would say the older generation that this was not commonplace for them as they started, that we just kind of have to give a little push to say, hey, this is kind of where everything's going now, and this is what we need.
Yeah.
And most of them are more than happy to help out and do what they can.
And is that effective? Are you able to measure that at all, or see the effects of that, or get a sense of it?
It's hard because since we mainly do not deal direct to consumer. We deal direct to dealer. It's very tricky because we can't tell. I can tell them so much about our strings, but if they don't go to the dealer themselves and request it, the dealer's not going to buy it from us. And then we get the customers saying, well, I can't find these anywhere. So some of it is doing that, getting them so excited that they do start doing it. So then you can start looking and say, oh, dealers have actually started ordering this one more, or trying to do some strategic posts in like a certain area, like, the greater Los Angeles area, and then start just paying attention to what those dealers are ordering and seeing how that coincides.
Yeah. Well, a lot of times you have to look at just the results and say, well, it looks like there may be a correlation here if you can't do a direct measurement on something. But you can look into these kind of subcategories and see how they're responding and then draw some conclusions, based on that. It seems like GHS has some really staple-like products in their line, have for a long time. So
absolutely.
So I guess I'm kind of curious, do you still see opportunities for innovation? And if so, what might they be?
Oh, yeah. But I mean, it's very tricky because guitar strings by design are very simple.
Sure.
Especially when you're talking about an electric guitar set, 3 of the strings are plain steel already. So there's nothing really to be done with those. And also as creatures of habit, even though new things can come out, new innovations, 85% of the market's always going to buy nickel-plated steel strings, and that's just the industry standard. And that's cool because I'd rather have people play what they like. But it's trying to find out where things are missing. For example, a couple years back, and we've noticed, and it's still going, is that the 7 and 8 string guitar market was really picking up more. So, and at that point, we had 2 sets of 7 string in our Boomers line, and they were doing okay. But we started talking with a lot of our artists that would start buying those sets, but then they would start buying singles, and you'd start looking at that saying, okay, why are they buying all these singles like this? These are on gauges. And they'd say, well, it's because I have this new 8 string or I'm using this 7 string. So it's I'm not sure how much of it that was really innovation as much as it was just taking what we already have and seeing how we could make it match the needs of the modern player.
That you kind of sprung something in my head as we're talking about that. We're going to be talking with an old friend of mine, Bill Conklin, who's down in Springfield, Missouri. I've often referred to him as one of the kings of extended range. He's he's
Absolutely.
built tons of stuff, and so I'm kind of wondering what the effect of that. I understand that other companies now you're seeing a lot more builders going into 8-9 string basses. I mean, that's extreme, but you're seeing more of it and more mainstream. So has that affected your product line? I mean, you were just touching on it, but is that a significant effect or small?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially with not so much, I would say, like the bigger one was like when the 5-string bass really started taking hold, because then you started saying, oh, we've really got to start coming up with these sets that have a good low B string. And then the 6-string bass came along, and that's okay. And we've got some stuff for 7, but it'll play an effect depending on how the market accepts that. Mm-hmm. The 7-string guitar is really kicking right now. And I mean, that's one of those guitars too that even jazz players have a 7-string on some guys.
Mm-hmm. A lot of it.
8-string guitar players are there, but I think they're much like the 6-string bass players, that they know exactly what they're going for, and it's much more they're much more discerning.
And there's different techniques too in playing those instruments. It's not the same old strum and pick and kind of thing. Right. You got all kinds of other techniques.
And I've got a 6-string bass myself that I've played for many, many years, but really when it comes down to it, I'll still grab a 4. So I think, or a 5. And I think that's where some of this comes down to also, is that, some of these guys that are going to there aren't a whole lot of players that strict solely just to the one, one type that isn't, like a 4-string bass or a 6-string guitar. There's a lot of guys that'll have those, but then they still have those staples in their thing. But it's still something that we want to look at, and say, and look at it periodically and say, hey, what do you think about revisiting this? Like we've had a couple, especially with players that I've noticed, even though we don't do like a 7 or 8 string bass set per se, we have a lot of guys that will play a 5 string, but they will tune it down, like the bottom 5 of it, of like an 8 string bass, so it's got a low F sharp. So we've been working with those guys to find out how we can make something that suits their needs, but then also aligns itself with those staple products, so it's not too far off. Mm-hmm. So,
well, it sounds like you're on top of it, and it's certainly something to keep an eye on. As we kind of close this out, I want to just ask you this big picture question, sure, which is really about what you see as the big picture image of the string industry today, and then where does GHS fit into that big picture?
Yeah, the string industry, for the most part, follows the guitar industry really closely, as I always felt that's like a chicken or the egg kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But right now, it's been interesting to note because while innovation is pushing the envelope and things, the music that's really catching on lately is vintage based and using instruments that are not, that are, even if they are new, they are very vintage in nature. The past 2 years have seen a huge boon in short scale basses. And whether that's because the musician themselves are aging, so they like playing something a little shorter that's more comfortable, or even that just, an old Gibson EBO is just in vogue again.
Wow.
It's a lot of that stuff is now going back. So we're seeing a bigger thing in flat wounds, pure nickel strings and things like that. But it's also trying to see, at least from GHS, how do we skirt that line of saying, okay, you want flat wounds? Well, we've made them for years and this is the original formula. But then how could we also say, but if you want to try something that's just a little more tweaked, it's the same thing, but we've kind of taken these new ideas that have come out between balanced tension and balanced gauges, things like that we've applied to these older recipes to see how we can skirt that line. And then on the complete opposite end, we've got all these progressive modern players that are using lowered tunings or altered tunings with multi-scale instruments that we need to pay attention to.
Sure.
And something like that's even as simple as coming out with just our string tension guide so they can look at everything and say, okay, I'm going to buy this set, but now I'm going to use a 56 on the bottom instead of the 52 that comes with it because that's what I want. So it's trying to offer up as many tools as we can to help educate the customer. I did a workshop 2 weeks back at the Kalamazoo Fretboard Festival, mm-hmm, and my opening line on there was, I'm not here to sell you on GHS strings, although if you did buy some, that would make my job easier. What I really want you to do is to walk away from this workshop with the knowledge that you can walk into a store, you can look at the string wall, and you can make an extremely informed decision at a moment's notice based on your needs.
That's kind of an educational motive there, and just making them smarter purchasers, right?
Right, because when it really comes down to it, there aren't a whole lot of string winding companies around as opposed to brands. Mm-hmm. If there's let's say 30 brands of strings out there, and I mean that's a very loose guess, there's probably 12 winding companies that do that.
Yeah. And
from those 12 winding companies, they probably order from 6 different wire manufacturers, and those wire manufacturers get their raw materials from like 2 places.
So it really narrows down. Wow.
Right. So it really comes down to someone saying, well, this nickel string is better than this one. It's like, well, that's going to come down into just how it's designed over anything else.
And so some of those things can be subtle, but somebody's paying attention, they're going to recognize it, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And that's where you make those decisions to let people know, hey, this is what brand A does over this is what brand B does. And that allows someone to say, they're both great, but I prefer brand A because of this.
Yeah. And from your perspective, you're hoping that brand A is GHS. Is that right?
Well, it couldn't hurt. It helps pay rent.
Awesome. Jon, that's going to do it for us today, but this has been a really informative chat, and I'm really happy that you were able to come on the show with us today. And I hope
thank you.
that we'll talk again in the future and kind of compare notes and see how things have changed down the road.
Oh, absolutely. That would be great, Jeff.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and we'll talk again soon.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome back to The Value Shot, where we talk about ideas and basic methodologies that you can integrate into your everyday activities in business and often in your personal lives as well. But of course, our primary focus is on having a positive effect on your business or career. Now, if you've listened to previous segments, you'll know that I'm big on creating strong foundations built on basic principles, utilizing simple but powerful ideas. In the last episode, I talked about the perils of the expectation game. And I said, for me, there are two kinds: primary or operational expectations, and secondary or variable expectations. Primary expectations tend to be technical or operational in nature, like airplanes flying and toasters toasting, whereas secondary expectations refer to most situations with variable outcomes, like business strategies or life experiences, to name a couple. And I explained that I had learned to treat these secondary expectations not as expectations at all, but as one giant generic expectation that I described as operating in the expectancy of the best possible result, knowing there are often different pathways that will get us to the destinations we seek. Now, while I've said that this is all really simple foundational stuff designed to help you make better business decisions, I understand that it's occasionally helpful to be able to relate it to a real situational example. So here's a question for you. Have you ever experienced a cash flow crisis of any kind? Most people will say yes. If you said no, you might want to keep listening just in case. Now, I want to keep this simple as always, but try to imagine the last cash flow crisis you had to deal with and how you reacted to it. Did you tighten up and narrow your thinking to the one or maybe two possible avenues that might solve the crisis, not realizing that you may have already gone down those paths to little or no avail, and you're about to embark on Einstein's insanity routine, at which point things usually only get worse, and you may go into a spiral of sorts. Not fun, not good. Now, what's happening here, in my view, is that we're trying to solve our problem using operational expectation theory with a variable expectation reality. We're trying to apply a narrow expectation of a solution to a problem that isn't part of an operational structure. They often don't match up. The solution, on the other hand, can be and often is something that is not on our radar. We haven't considered it because we're so used to playing the expectation game, because it's deceptively comfortable and doesn't require us to think out of the cage. The result is we have unfortunately closed the options window. We can't see any other way. And we start making decisions without the benefit of knowing there may be a variety of solutions if we could only allow them to be seen. Now, I'm going to stop here for a moment because, remember, we need to keep it simple. If you're going through a cash flow crisis at the moment, the tendency for us is to look for a quick fix. It's urgent. It's easy to be impatient. And you may not be happy with my advice. I can't write you a check or give you the name of a guy that will help you out of a jam that you probably don't want to know anyway. All I can really do is tell you what's worked for me. And if you can use some piece of what I have to say to your benefit, I'm a happy guy. I will smile. So how would I handle a situation like this or similar? First, I don't allow myself to get emotionally wrapped up by the problem. The problem does not define me. I step away from the problem. If I don't, I cannot see the solution. I have to keep my eye on the destination and keep all my options open on how I'm going to get there. Sound familiar? I already know that the solution exists. It always does. Always. It may not be what I was expecting. It frequently is not. It may not happen in the time frame I may have hoped for, but that does not mean there won't be an acceptable or better result. What I try to do is stay focused on what I said before, the best possible result, and I'm leaving the widest path open for that result to manifest. Now, I said at the front of the show that it was important to focus less on what we are not and more on what we are. Even though we say no reviews, no demos, no idle chatter, well, truthfully, that's designed to get your attention. Remember, that's step 1 of the 3 C's. In step 2, I want you to know what we are. We are unique and providing you with something you won't get anywhere else, among other things. What action do I want to compel? Simple. Listen to the show, engage with the show, support the show, and help us spread the word. Simple stuff, my friends. And you know, there's a lot more to talk about beyond these 5-minute segments. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and tell you that I fully expect there to be many, many more episodes. And I'm operating in the expectancy that they will be the best they can possibly be. Thanks for listening, and remember to stay positive, stay focused, and keep all your options open. And I will see you on episode 7. And that's it for this episode of Guitar Business Radio. Thanks for being with us. You can stay tuned and stay in touch at guitarbusinessradio.com.